The city woke up before the sun fully rose. From above, it looked whole, but on the ground it was broken into two lives that never truly touched. On one side stood tall glass towers, their windows catching the early light like polished mirrors. On the other side were dusty streets, narrow paths, and homes built close together, where children swept the ground every morning and water was carried in buckets. Cars passed from one world to the other every day, yet respect never crossed with them. Wealth and poverty lived side by side, but they did not greet each other. The city breathed inequality as naturally as air, and no one questioned it anymore. Behind high gates topped with shining wire, laughter was loud and easy. Here, guards stood stiff in clean uniforms while expensive cars slid through wide driveways. Inside these walls, people gathered for brunches and evening parties, speaking softly about deals, fashion, and power. Respect was bought with brands and connections. A woman laughed and said, "If you don't show it, they won't fear you." Her friends nodded, lifting glasses filled with cold drinks. Pride grew quietly here, fed by comfort and praise, never learning how to bow. Among these people stood a woman many admired. She gave money to charities, smiled for cameras, and spoke about helping the poor. But behind closed doors, her heart beat to a different drum. She believed power was proof of worth. Money, to her, was not just comfort, it was judgment. "I worked hard to reach this place," she once said to a friend. "Those who are still down there simply did not try enough." Her words carried weight. People listened. People feared her disappointment. In her world, success was loud, and weakness deserved silence. Across the city, where roads cracked and streetlights flickered, another life moved quietly. Drivers washed cars before sunrise. Guards stood all night at gates they would never enter. Cleaners rode crowded buses while the city slept. Their names were rarely remembered. They were called by uniforms, not by voices. At roadside stalls, they shared small meals and tired smiles. "Tomorrow will come," one would say, and another would answer, "We will still rise." They served a city that did not see them, carrying its weight without complaint. Among them was a driver who woke each day before the call to prayer faded. He ironed his shirt carefully, even when the cloth had thinned with age. His room was small, his bed simple, but his movements were calm and ordered. He greeted neighbors softly and helped when he could. At work, he arrived early, opened doors, and waited without impatience. When spoken to harshly, he lowered his eyes, not from weakness, but from control. At night, as he locked his door, he whispered to himself, "Dignity is free. No one can take it unless I give it." And so the city moved on, loud on one side, quiet on the other, unaware that its balance was already beginning to shift. Each morning, he waited patiently by the car, hands folded neatly, eyes lowered in respect. "Good morning, madam," he said, voice calm and steady. She barely noticed, often speaking into her phone or glancing at her reflection in the window. To her, he was invisible unless he erred. Loyalty was expected, not valued. She measured life by power and wealth, and he measured his life by quiet dignity. When she spoke, it was about deals, influence, and appearances, never about the person who held her world in motion. That evening, the city's elite gathered beneath chandeliers and golden lights. Music flowed like rivers of wealth, laughter sparkled like wine, and conversations were weapons, cutting subtly to assert status. Politicians leaned closer to influencers, exchanging nods that spoke louder than words. Every glance measured worth, every compliment tested loyalty. The hall was a stage, and everyone performed a carefully curated self. Her friends whispered, sipping from crystal glasses. "Imagine the driver here," one said, smiling. The woman's eyes gleamed with mischief. "It would be entertaining," she said softly, leaning back in her chair. Laughter followed, easy and careless, carrying a cruelty that masked their fear of losing standing. "Poverty," she added, "is always amusing when it steps into our light." The decision was made in a heartbeat. A message was typed and sent, brief and cold, asking him to attend the evening's gathering. No warmth, no respect, only the assumption that he would feel small. Far away, he received the note. His fingers hovered over the phone, but he read without complaint. "When they throw stones in jest," he murmured to himself, "truth walks anyway." And just like that, a careless joke began its journey toward destiny. The driver read the message quietly, his fingers resting lightly on the screen. No curse, no anger escaped his lips. "If they call me a guest for laughter," he whispered to himself, "then I will walk, and the earth will carry my dignity." His calm acceptance filled the room like a shadow moving silently. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. The wind slowed, the dust settled on the streets, and even the chatter of early markets seemed hushed. Something was coming, though no one yet knew what, and the quiet in his acceptance stirred unease far beyond his own heart. Inside the glittering towers, she adjusted her necklace, eyes gleaming with the reflection of the chandelier. Pride had grown within her like a tree whose roots were money and whose branches brushed the sky of influence. Every decision, every glance, every measured word reinforced her belief that wealth was a crown that could never be challenged. She had learned early that those without riches bowed easily, and the lesson had hardened into certainty. She was untouchable. "They do not matter," she said aloud, and her friends nodded as if echoing sacred law. Money had long become her measure of human worth. She looked at the poor and saw only a mirror of weakness. Effort, sacrifice, and quiet strength were invisible to her. "Why do they toil so," she once mused, "when they are destined to remain beneath our gaze?" Every act of giving was weighed with calculation, every gesture of generosity paired with expectation. To her, poverty was a flaw written in flesh, a sign that some had failed the world simply by being born without wealth. Around her, laughter swirled like incense, fragrant yet sharp. Her friends fed on mockery, teasing and jesting at the expense of those less fortunate. "Bring him here," one whispered with a smirk. "Let us see how he carries himself among lions," said another. Their cruel joy was a game, a sport to maintain dominance, to ensure that no one dared step above the invisible lines of class. Each laugh echoed like a drumbeat of privilege, announcing their power and feeding the arrogance that had taken root in the woman's heart. She leaned back, a small smile curving her lips. "It will be amusing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "A lesson in humility for those who forget their place." The invitation, typed quickly and without thought for dignity, was sent. The click of the send button was like a whisper in the air, yet it carried a weight no one yet felt. Far across the city, the driver would receive it, and his calm acceptance would begin to tilt the scales of pride. In that quiet moment, before the party, before the laughter, before the fall, the air itself seemed to pulse with tension. The stage was set, and the city held its breath. The laughter started soft, like a ripple across water, but it grew fast, loud, and hungry. Around the table, her friends leaned closer, eyes bright, voices sharp. "Imagine him here," one whispered, the grin stretching across her face. "Yes, let him stumble in our light," another added. The sound of amusement was no longer simple joy, it demanded a victim. The woman's lips curved in satisfaction. "He will learn humility," she said, voice low but certain. In that moment, the laughter was a drum, calling for someone to be small so the powerful could feel tall. Mockery had become performance, and the room thrummed with it. Across the city, a phone buzzed softly in a small, dim room. The driver picked it up, reading the words that would stretch the night long. His eyes widened, a pause, then a calm settling over his face. He held the phone lightly, as if it were a stone dropped at his feet. Confusion tugged at his chest. "Why me?" he whispered. The message disrupted the quiet rhythm of his life, where days were predictable and nights offered rest. Now, a new path had been laid before him, heavy with expectation and uncertainty. Fear crept in quietly. He remembered every time he had been laughed at or overlooked, every time his poverty had been a silent sentence. Shame wrapped itself around his chest. He knew what society expected of him: stumble, apologize, remain small. And yet, in the stillness, he drew a slow breath. "I will not bow to fear," he murmured, though his heart thudded against his ribs. The weight of being seen pressed upon him, yet he straightened his back, letting dignity settle like armor over his shoulders. Years of quiet labor came into his mind, the long mornings before sunrise, carrying water, cleaning homes, standing through endless days while others rested. Every sacrifice, every act of diligence, had been invisible to the world. No applause had ever been given. He remembered nights mending his shoes, saving coins, keeping small promises to his family, and learning patience from the sun that rose whether anyone noticed or not. Each step had built him, even if no eyes had witnessed the effort. The city outside moved on as it always did. Buses rattled along flickering streets, and neon lights blinked over dusty roads. Families in cramped rooms ate, spoke, and slept, carrying their own quiet battles. The driver stepped out into the night, blending into the movement, yet alone in his thoughts. Each light reflected both the hardship and the hope of those unseen. The city's rhythm was harsh, yet it taught endurance. And in that darkness, he walked forward, carrying his life's silent story into a world that expected him to falter, ready to face the night and what the dawn might demand. The night in the city had two faces. On one side, crystal chandeliers dripped light across polished floors, spilling gold on velvet carpets. Music floated like incense, blending with laughter that echoed carelessly against walls adorned with art bought to impress, not to inspire. Waiters moved swiftly, carrying glasses filled with sparkling drinks, while guests measured one another with practiced glances. Every smile, every word was currency, exchanged for influence, gossip, and approval. The air itself seemed heavy with wealth, thick and fragrant, untouched by the dust of the streets just beyond the gates. At the same hour, the driver sat on the edge of his narrow bed. He folded his uniform with careful hands, polishing his shoes quietly. There was no fanfare, no music, no chatter, only the whisper of his own breathing and the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the phone, thinking of the invitation. His home, simple and worn, smelled faintly of firewood and morning bread. In silence, he combed his hair, checked his clothes, and straightened his back. His preparation was small, humble, and precise. He expected nothing from the world beyond these walls, but he would give it all the dignity he carried. Across the city, the woman stood before a mirror, smoothing the folds of her dress, brushing her hair with long, deliberate strokes. Her friends hovered nearby, whispering and laughing, telling stories that sharpened teeth. "He will arrive, and we will see him stumble," one said. "Yes," another agreed. "It will be perfect." Her lips curved into a confident smile, the kind that believes power and laughter are one and the same. The joke had been polished, rehearsed in her mind to shine publicly, and she waited for the moment it would crown her superiority. The driver, reading the room in his mind before even stepping outside, felt fear, yes, but under it, a quiet hope. "I will not shrink," he said softly. "I will not vanish because they expect me to." His dignity was his shield, and he held it close, invisible yet unbroken. He knew the world would judge him before knowing him, yet he refused to bow to their expectations. Finally, he stepped out of his neighborhood, leaving behind familiar faces, the calls of children, the smell of baked bread, and the murmurs of neighbors who knew him by name. Here, he had been human, recognized for small kindnesses and labor unseen by outsiders. Ahead lay a world that would only see the uniform, not the man beneath it. Still, he walked with steady steps, carrying years of quiet strength into a night built for spectacle, mockery, and lessons that were about to unfold. The driver stepped into the district of power, and immediately the city seemed different. Streets gleamed under the glow of streetlights, luxury cars lined the sidewalks, and tall buildings reflected neon like mirrors of ambition. The air was thick with expectation, each step he took pulling him closer to a fate shaped by others' laughter. Silence hovered around him, not the peace of home, but the tense hush before a storm. Every eye that passed would measure, every whisper could wound, and the joke, so carefully prepared, was only moments from reality. Inside the grand hall, music flowed like rivers of warmth and light. A melody of percussion and strings mingled with the tinkling of crystal glasses. Perfume hung heavily in the air, each scent competing for attention, each laugh carefully measured. Joy here was loud and performative, built not on connection, but on the theater of appearance. Guests smiled in the right places, laughed at rehearsed moments, and drank in spectacle more than substance. The room glimmered with brilliance, yet beneath it, a subtle emptiness whispered through the gilded walls. Every guest seemed to speak with clothing. Sequins, tailored suits, and gowns shimmered under chandeliers, and each step, each posture, silently told a story of wealth, taste, and influence. Eyes scanned others, measuring respect in silks and jewels. Conversation dipped and rose, guided by the unspoken rule, to be noticed, one must first be seen. Character, effort, or virtue mattered little here. Appearances were the currency of power, and each guest traded heavily. At the center, she waited, radiant and unshakable, like a queen perched on a throne. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, and a smile curved her lips as she joked softly with friends. "He will arrive," she said, her voice certain, "and we shall see him stumble." The friends leaned closer, sharing whispers that carried like sparks through dry grass, feeding the fire of mockery. She believed this night would crown her superiority, every laugh a jewel to her pride. Yet behind the laughter, something faltered. It reached no heart, no warmth. The smiles were polished, the jokes rehearsed, the amusement hollow. Each chuckle hid insecurity, each glance masked fear, fear of losing status, of being outshone, of revealing weakness. In the midst of light and perfume, the emptiness of privilege whispered a truth no one dared speak. Power that rests on mockery is fragile, and laughter without love or respect echoes only into silence. The driver's footsteps echoed softly on the cracked pavement, each step carrying the weight of years spent unseen. The city behind him hummed with life, the clatter of buses, the calls of late-night vendors, the distant laughter of children playing in the dim streetlights. Each memory pressed against him, waking before dawn to polish cars, carrying water, navigating a life of quiet discipline, and enduring eyes that never lingered with kindness. Yet, with every step, a quiet resolve settled deeper in his chest. He would walk into this world, into their laughter and their judgment, holding the dignity he had earned in silence. At the gates, the guards' eyes swept over him like hawks circling prey. His uniform was plain, his shoes scuffed, his posture steady but modest. Whispers passed between the men, a nod, a subtle tilt of the head, a judgment rendered before a single word escaped his lips. In this city, the gatekeepers of power maintained their walls not only with locks but with scorn, ensuring that the poor remained visible only as service, never as equals. He met their gaze briefly, calm, refusing to shrink under their silent scrutiny. The door loomed ahead, its polished wood gleaming under the glow of chandeliers within. It asked questions without words, challenging him to prove his place or retreat. He paused, hand hovering near the handle, sensing the weight of invisible barriers. Every moment stretched, a pause heavy with history, expectation, and the unspoken truth that crossing this threshold meant confronting the divide the city had built for generations. Inside, the floors shone like water under the lights, reflecting faces and gowns, sparkling glasses and pride. His shoes, worn from years of labor, felt out of place, a quiet testament to the life he had led, a life of endurance, not display. Each reflection reminded him of the gulf between worlds, the polished wealth of others, and the silent, uncelebrated strength that had brought him here. The music swelled, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell like a tide, but within him there was calm. The noise surrounded him, but it did not reach him. His heart beat steady, grounded in years of surviving without applause, of keeping faith in labor unseen. While the world around him performed, he carried the quiet strength of a life lived fully, even when ignored. Here, in the midst of excess, his presence was his own victory, a silent power that neither wealth nor mockery could take away. The driver stood just beyond the entrance, his back straight, shoulders squared, a quiet defiance radiating from him. He did not bow, he did not plead, he did not shrink. His uniform, simple and worn, could not hide the dignity that had been forged through years of endurance and silent labor. Every glance from the guards, every whispered judgment from the staff, met only a calm gaze. In a world that expected submission, his body refused to bow. Inside, whispers darted from one guest to another like sparks across dry grass. "He will stumble," one voice hissed. "Watch him trip," another added, laughter restrained, sharp with anticipation. Gossip moved faster than truth, twisting and growing with each telling, spreading a tale before the man had even entered. It was the village pattern transplanted into marble halls. The crowd knows what it wants, and it waits for the story to unfold. Time seemed to stretch, seconds growing heavy and thick as the guests murmured and shifted. The music continued, but it softened under the weight of expectation. Every tick of the clock echoed like a drumbeat in the minds of the waiting elite. They had prepared a spectacle, a humiliation that would be remembered, and yet, as the moment stretched, curiosity sharpened into tension. He stepped fully into view, the threshold now claiming him as its own. The arranged joke, the trap of laughter and shame, could no longer hide in shadows. The air between the polished floors and glittering chandeliers thickened with the anticipation of others. Every eye in the room seemed to measure, to calculate, to hunger for the collapse that had been promised. The doors swung open slowly, deliberately, like the steady beat of a ceremonial drum announcing fate. All eyes turned as one. The music dimmed beneath the collective inhale of the room. The laughter paused mid-breath, and the whispers froze on tongues. Silence fell, heavy and expectant, wrapping around the man who stood calm at the center. In that suspended moment, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for truth to step forward. The driver stepped across the threshold, his posture steady, eyes calm, shoulders carrying a quiet authority that no one had expected. The laughter that had been ready to swallow him paused mid-air, caught on tongues and in throats. The room, glittering with chandeliers and perfume, seemed to shift, uncertain how to receive him. He moved as though he belonged, though every polished floor beneath his worn shoes had been meant to mock his journey. His shoes scuffed softly against the shining marble, contrasting sharply with the world around him. They were not elegant, not crafted for applause, but they carried the weight of miles walked, sacrifices made, and nights endured. The floor tried to laugh at them, but in their quiet truth, they became symbols, not of shame, but of steadfastness and life lived with integrity. The laughter died mid-breath. Faces froze, smiles faltered, and the carefully arranged air of superiority cracked. Guests who had gathered to witness embarrassment now wavered, uncertain, as the spell of mockery lost its power. Even the music, lively a moment before, seemed to dip under the heavy pause, sensing the shift in rhythm. Voices, previously loud with gossip and expectation, cut short like broken drums. Conversations faltered and stopped, hands frozen mid-gesture. The movement of the room slowed, each footstep hesitant, each whisper caught by the stillness. It was as though the hall itself, steeped in status and power, had been reminded that it could not command every heart. Then, eyes began to recognize what pride had ignored. Powerful figures, influencers, and business leaders, once laughing behind masks of entitlement, now saw the man clearly. The driver was no mere servant to be ridiculed. There was history, there was knowledge, there was quiet authority carried in his measured steps. Assumptions shattered, what had been expected, a spectacle of humiliation, had not arrived. Instead, the man they had overlooked now held the room in an unspoken truth that demanded respect. A hush fell over the room as the first whispers began. They were quiet at first, tentative, like leaves rustling under a gentle wind. Then, names started to surface, spoken softly but carrying weight. "Is that? It cannot be." The driver's accomplishments, long ignored by society, traveled faster than the spoken word, reaching ears that had prepared for mockery, only to meet disbelief. An elder businessman tilted his head, eyes narrowing in recognition. "This man. He built half the schools in the northern districts," he murmured, voice low but carrying through the still air. A renowned philanthropist nodded subtly, lips pressing together, respect replacing the casual judgment they had rehearsed. Every piece of his past, the long nights of labor, the initiatives quietly changing lives, the influence that once commanded councils, stood in stark contrast to the invisible servant they had assumed he was. Power bowed without a command. Those who had been the arbiters of prestige now shifted subtly, adjusting their posture, inclining their heads, offering nods that spoke louder than applause. Authority in its truest form does not clamor for attention, it commands through presence. And here, it was undeniable. The driver did not speak, did not raise a hand, yet the room responded as if the air itself acknowledged his stature. The rich woman felt the ground shift beneath her feet. A small laugh caught in her throat, turning bitter. She had planned to show dominance, to amuse herself and her friends with the embarrassment of a man she had long ignored. Instead, her carefully crafted joke crumbled like dry earth. Eyes that had anticipated ridicule now bore into her with quiet scrutiny. Her smile faltered, her shoulders stiffened, and she sensed the invisible thread of control she had held slipping from her grasp. Pride, once hidden behind layers of jewelry, perfume, and polite laughter, now lay exposed in the open light. The room no longer focused on the driver's supposed inferiority, but on the arrogance that had orchestrated this spectacle. Guests whispered, heads shook slightly, and the silence itself passed judgment. Her cruelty, once hidden behind status and laughter, was now visible to all, turning the spotlight from the intended victim to the woman who had underestimated the quiet strength of a life lived with dignity. The driver's presence now filled the room like a rising drumbeat. Once invisible, he no longer needed to speak to claim attention. Heads turned subtly, then fully, as eyes traced the quiet authority in his posture. The laughter that had once promised to swallow him fell away like dry leaves in a sudden wind. Even the most arrogant voices found themselves caught in silence. One by one, whispers died, and the room's energy shifted, bending toward him without demand or command. The man who had been unseen became impossible to ignore. Shame burned in the hearts of those who had anticipated mockery. The rich woman's smile faltered, a sudden heat crawling up her neck as she realized the weight of her cruelty. Friends exchanged glances, shameful and silent. No one dared speak, for every word felt like it would only confirm their complicity. Fear of exposure trembled in the air, heavier than the music, stronger than the perfume, more commanding than any gesture. The gathering reflected the city itself, a place where wealth had often blinded judgment, where appearances determined respect, and where dignity had been measured by banknotes rather than by actions. Eyes that had once ignored the driver now understood the truth of what had been overlooked for so long. The room, like the city outside, revealed its lies. How easy it is to forget the value of quiet strength when wrapped in opulence and pride. Justice arrived without a shout, without violence. No one was struck, no hand raised in retaliation. Yet, in the simple acknowledgement of truth, arrogance crumbled. The driver's calm, his dignity unbroken, spoke louder than any punishment ever could. Power had shifted silently but irrevocably. Humility now occupied the space once held by haughty laughter. The rich woman stood, rigid, composed for the room, but inside, her world had fractured. Every careful calculation of mockery had failed. The joke she had crafted to humiliate now rested upon her own shoulders. Her confidence, once towering, sagged under the weight of unspoken judgment, her internal collapse invisible yet undeniable. And the man at the center of the room stood still. Not a word, not a gesture beyond the natural grace of a man who knew his worth. The silence that surrounded him was complete, heavy with realization and respect. In that quiet, every question was answered, every assumption corrected, and every injustice silently acknowledged. His presence alone restored dignity, proving that truth and patience, more than wealth or noise, command the deepest reverence. The city awoke slowly, its usual rhythm unsettled. The sun climbed over glass towers and dusty streets alike, but the chatter that normally greeted morning was muted. In every home and shop, whispers replaced laughter. The memory of the night before pressed heavily upon minds that had once felt untouchable, and no one spoke it aloud with joy. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if the city itself held its breath. What had been expected to be a spectacle of mockery had become a story of humility, echoing silently through the air. In the markets, merchants spoke softly between baskets of yams and grains, repeating the tale with careful respect. In offices, clerks and managers exchanged glances, murmuring details that were no longer a game but a warning. The gossip moved like water through the city, shaping the way people thought, teaching without yelling, as old storytellers would have done in village squares. Every repetition carried the weight of lesson rather than laughter. Reputation shifted like sand after a sudden storm. Those who had been overlooked now held the quiet admiration of neighbors and strangers alike. The humble found strength in recognition, while those who had relied on arrogance to shield themselves felt the earth move beneath their feet. Walls that once held them high now seemed fragile, and whispers of respect trailed the quiet figures of endurance and dignity. Alone, the rich woman faced her reflection. There was no applause, no approving nods, only her own eyes staring back with a faint tremor of unease. For the first time, she measured herself not by gold, nor by smiles bought with flattery, but by the emptiness that lingered inside. The mirror revealed what the crowd could not: the sting of cruelty, the folly of pride, and the quiet power of the man she had sought to humiliate. And in that stillness, consequences could not be bought. No wealth, no influence, no whispered favors could erase the truth now known to all. The lesson hung in the city's air like smoke after a fire. Dignity cannot be stolen, pride cannot hide, and those who mock without honor will one day find themselves the object of a silence heavier than any laughter. The driver stood in the middle of the room, calm as the river before the storm. He said nothing. He needed no words to answer the mockery that had once been meant for him. His silence carried a weight heavier than shouts, sharper than insults. Every eye that had anticipated his stumble now met only his steady gaze. In that quiet, strength spoke louder than revenge. He walked away with the same slow, measured steps he had taken into the hall, yet each step seemed taller than before. People watched him leave and realized that dignity could not be bought, and respect, once earned, towers higher than wealth. Whispers of admiration fluttered like wind through the crowd, subtle but impossible to ignore. Outside, those who worked in the shadows, drivers, guards, cleaners, began to be seen with new eyes. Conversations in markets, streets, and offices changed. The labor that had been invisible now carried quiet honor, and the city started to understand the value of those it had overlooked. The silence of the night became a teacher. Mothers told children of the calm man who stood firm, elders passed the story from mouth to ear, teaching that power is not always loud, and courage is not always shown in weapons or gold. The city remembered that night as a turning point. It was not gossip, nor scandal, that endured, but a moral lesson. Pride had faltered, and humility had stood, like the roots of the baobab holding firm against the wind. And in the dust of the streets, where kings had once walked unnoticed, the people learned a truth older than the city itself. Greatness often moves quietly among the unseen, and those who laugh at humility forget that dust once carried kings.